City of Ventura. We are doing this joint effort with the Public Works Department, as well as we've hired Ramey and Associates, who will be doing the bulk of the presentation this evening for the Climate Action and Resiliency Plan. So thank you so much for joining this evening. If you were able to attend our in-person open house workshops last month that we held in the atrium at City Hall, this will have a lot of similar information, and when we do the activities and breakout rooms, a lot of similar questions. So if you did attend, you're going to see some of that material, but also we have additional material in this meeting to share with everybody. So thank you again for joining, and then I'll go ahead and kick it off to Eric, who will take us through the presentation.
Thanks, Netta, and good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Kierkovich. I'm a principal at Ramey and Associates. We're grateful to have you all here this evening to participate in our Climate Action and Resilience Plan virtual community meeting. We have a big team of people with us tonight. You'll get an opportunity to hear from several of them during the presentation tonight and through our breakout rooms. So I'll let them introduce themselves through the course of the evening. Next slide. But really, before we get started tonight, we have live interpretation available in Spanish, and then I'm going to ask Clara, one of our interpreters this evening tonight, to read the following. And then once she's finished reading this, we'll open the Spanish interpretation channel and people can access that information. Clara, would you please read this for us?
Muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos a esta reunión que va a ser interpretada simultáneamente al español. Si está usted conectado o conectada por medio de una computadora, diríjase en la parte de abajo de su pantalla y haga clic en el icono del mundito. Después haga clic en interpretación y por último en español. Si está utilizando un teléfono inteligente, diríjase a los 3 puntos que verá en la parte de al lado de su pantalla y haga clic ahí para seleccionar interpretación y nuevamente español. La función de interpretación se activará brevemente. Gracias.
Thank you, Clara. And with that, Lily is going to open up the Spanish language channel for interpretation this evening. So welcome everyone again. On your screen here in front of you is really our roadmap for the evening. We're prepared to share a little bit about the Climate Action and Resilience Plan with you tonight. Some of the technical analysis that we've done about the anticipated impacts of climate change, both globally and locally in Ventura. And then we'll talk a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions in Ventura and some greenhouse gas reduction measures overall. We'll talk a little bit about the engagement in next steps. And then really the bulk of the meeting tonight will be hearing from you about climate action and adaptation policies and programs. So we'll be running what we call a virtual open house, where you can sort of move from room to room and talk about your ideas, your policies that you would like to see as part of this planning process. We have a few discussion questions to help guide the conversation tonight, but it's really a free-form discussion in your breakout rooms. But before we begin the formal presentation this evening, my colleague Robin Wong will be facilitating a short demographic poll to see who's in the audience tonight. And so part of our job as we're going through this process is really tracking who's participating in the process to make sure we're hearing from all members of the Ventura community. Robin, would you like to please facilitate the Menti poll?
Yeah, Lily, could you go ahead and put the link into the chat, please? Okay, so let me share my screen again. So what you can do is click on the link that Lily just put into the chat if you're using your computer. I think you can also click on it on your phone, and this will get you to this poll. I don't believe you have to log in, so we can just give everyone a chance to get situated here. Oh, I see someone's already, people are already like rearing to go. So our first question here, just to break the ice a little bit, is what is the best frozen treat? It's summer and, you know, Labor Day is coming up. Maybe you're having a picnic. So there's obviously many more frozen treats, but of these 5, what do you think is the best? Ice cream is coming up as the top answer here. Okay, give people a little bit longer to get situated, and then we'll move on to the demographics shortly. Some more people getting on. All right. I think maybe we can move on to the next question, which will be our first demographic question. As Eric said, we'd like to just see, you know, who's here tonight. We want to try to reach as many people who are representative of your community as possible, and it's just great to know who's participating. All right, so this first question here is, do you live in the city of Ventura? Sometimes, you know, we have people coming from different parts of the county, and then maybe other places as well. So some people who are not from the city. All right, looks like we have 20, which I think is about as many participants as we have. So, okay, I see that we have some non-City of Ventura residents as well as a slight majority of City of Ventura residents. This next question, if you live in the City of Ventura, is which part of the city do you live in? We have the neighborhoods here. So if you go ahead and select which one, or if you don't live in Ventura, you can click the last option, which is that you do not live in Ventura. All right. Thanks, everyone. This next question is, do you own or rent your residence? I see a lot of own. And if you're just joining us, you can click on the link in the chat to reach this, this interactive polling exercise. Yeah, see another person got added. Great. Okay, so we have, looks like a majority owners, but also about a quarter renters. Next question is, how many years have you lived in the city of Ventura? Again, if you don't live in Ventura, you can click the, you know, the NA option. I see a lot of longtime residents, over 21 years. Okay. All right, I'll give that a few more seconds. And this other one is, what is your age group? And if you don't feel comfortable answering, of course, you can just wait for me to move on to the next question. And which race or ethnic groups do you most identify? I don't recall if you can choose more than one, but you can try. And again, if you're not comfortable answering this, you can just wait to move on. All right. Okay, yeah, 2 more races is an option. Okay, great. And that is the end of our poll. Thanks everyone for that. And I'll go ahead and get back to our presentation.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We appreciate that. It really just helps us to understand who is participating, and as we go through the process, make sure we're doing the things necessary to reach the broadest range of people in the city. So you can go to the next slide. So tonight, I get the duty of going through and telling you a little bit about the CARP itself and about climate change. The Climate Action and Resilience Plan, or CARP as we call it for short, really represents the city's program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with state and local targets, and really helps to contribute to statewide efforts and regional efforts to adapt to the changing climate. The CARP really does help to establish a shared vision for climate action in the city, and we really hope that it builds on both the current work that's being done in the city and past work as well, things like the city's general plan, which is ongoing, the active transportation plan that's ongoing, the hazard mitigation plan that the city adopted recently, and the energy action plan. CARP is really supposed to build on and really honor the work that was done for all of those different efforts. It's also about identifying new and innovating practices for both the city to test and to implement and explore in the future, and really to help identify barriers to the implementation of main programs the city is already doing or that are happening regionally or happening with utilities locally. And what's interesting about a climate action and resilience plan is that these are really intended to be short-term implementation plans. And many of you have probably been involved in the general plan update process, which is a 20, 25-year vision for the future. Climate action plans are really intended to be a short-term action-oriented plan. Next slide. And so tonight we're going to be talking about a couple of different things, right? Strategies to reduce or mitigate greenhouse gases, and opportunities to adapt to or make the city more resilient to the impacts of climate change that the city is already facing and will experience in the future. And so when we use these terms, we always say that mitigation really attends to the consequences of climate, or the causes, to the causes of climate change, and adaptation really addresses the impacts of those. And so those are just some terms that you'll hear tonight over and over again to make sure everyone is clear on what those two things mean. And so the CARP itself will really act as the city's greenhouse gas reduction program or greenhouse gas mitigation program, inventorying emissions, estimating future emissions, establishing greenhouse gas reduction measures, and assessing the ability of those measures to help meet state greenhouse gas targets. The plan will also help define climate adaptation measures, which are consistent, say, with the city's local hazard mitigation plan, describing climate hazards and their vulnerability and potential vulnerabilities in the city, and then identifying those policies and actions to really address those vulnerabilities. So the CARP will do both of those two things. Next slide. So our team has done a fair amount of technical analysis, and we'll be doing more technical analysis as part of this process. So for example, the city prepared a community-wide greenhouse gas inventory for 2019, which will serve as a basis for a lot of our analysis. And this inventory documents the primary sources of emissions in the community, comparing emissions to 2015, and then forecasting those emissions out into the future. My colleague Sammy Taylor will be presenting the results of that analysis later this evening. We'll then conduct a greenhouse gas reduction analysis for the CARP. And what that means is we take different strategies to reduce emissions, we package them all together, we make assumptions about how quickly and how aggressively we implement those measures, and then we quantify, based on scientific research, the amount of emissions that are reduced from each of those different measures. That analysis is then compared to state greenhouse gas reduction targets to understand how close we can get to those targets. And tonight, really, we're here to hear from you about what some of those measures are and how we should implement those within the CARP. And then finally, we're also doing adaptation and resilience as part of this plan. So we developed a vulnerability assessment to identify existing and future climate hazards facing the city, some of the vulnerable infrastructure, assets, and populations. And so from there, we'll work with you to create adaptation strategies and measures to really attend to those particular risks. And again, tonight we'll be talking about those measures. Next slide. So to make sure that everyone's on the same page, I'm going to do a 5-slide what is climate change primer for those who are less familiar with this. And for many of you, you are already going to be pretty familiar with this content, but my job is really to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to be sort of on the same level of an understanding about climate change and the trends and projections for the change. And before I get started, I always want to say when I talk about climate change that it is one of the biggest challenges that we face, and there is a lot of confusion about it, but like, be certain that there are a few things we want everyone to know. And the first is that we really understand the problem. We know it's already impacting us and the impacts are accelerating, and that there are solutions to it. So some of this sounds doom and gloom, but we have opportunities to work towards being a safer, more resilient future. So you can go to the next slide. So climate change is caused by an increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this graphic really just shows very simply how the greenhouse effect works. Sunlight comes into the earth, some of that energy is reflected back into space, and then some of that energy is absorbed into the atmosphere. Now, when those greenhouse gases are absorbed in the atmosphere, they trap additional heat, and that causes warming. Greenhouse gases are super important. They make the planet fully livable. Without them, the average temperature would be about 60 degrees lower on our planet overall. But even slight increases in those greenhouse gas concentrations can affect and alter the climate. Next slide. So these greenhouse gases play a super important role in regulating the temperature of the planet. But in about the 1800s, we started burning more fossil fuels like coal and oil and natural gas in larger and larger quantities. And these fuels really powered the Industrial Revolution, but they also increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Next slide. So carbon dioxide began increasing with the Industrial Revolution, but then really accelerated in the 20th century. And at the same time, temperatures increased, tracking with those rising carbon dioxide levels. And so carbon dioxide is increasing, and it's causing the planet to warm. Next slide. Now, both past and very recent assessments in the strongest possible language yet say that unequivocal that human emissions of greenhouse gases have warmed the atmosphere, the ocean, and land. And these changes are really unprecedented and already affecting everyone around the globe. These include observed changes like heat waves, precipitation, droughts, sea level rise, just to name a few. Next slide. Now, this isn't just a global phenomenon, and I think that's sometimes where we get hung up on climate change, but Ventura is already experiencing the effects of a changing climate. We are already observing changes to temperature, precipitation patterns, sea level rise, wildfire patterns, and more. And we can anticipate that these changes will continue and even accelerate into the future, even with only moderate increases in greenhouse gases. Now, I'm going to walk through a few, but not all of these local impacts in a little bit more detail. Next slide. So during the last century, temperatures in California have risen pretty steadily, with the rate of warming really intensifying in the latter half of the 20th century, with those temperatures in Southern California rising faster than California as a whole. Now, climate models indicate that those temperatures will continue to increase in Southern California in Ventura, but along with just general warming temperatures, we're also seeing an increase in extreme heat events in California, and then in Southern California in particular. These extreme heat events are becoming more frequent, more intense, and lasting longer than they did in the past. Now, the increased frequency of extreme heat events can result in a lot of vulnerabilities, but in particular, it's an increased public health risk for things like heat stroke and even death amongst healthy people. And these risks, which you'll hear a lot, are disproportionately borne by the most socially vulnerable populations, like those experiencing homelessness, outdoor workers, and older adults. Next slide. So precipitation patterns are also changing, and in Southern California, we'll continue to see these large periods and fluctuations of precipitation with these dry years, these wet years. So these boom and bust cycles of rainfall are far more likely to happen within the region, where we get those big atmospheric rivers on some years, which can bring 50% of our rainfall in one event. for the entire year. But those big storm events are anticipated to increase with climate change, but also the inverse is true as well, as the changes in drought frequency, intensity, and duration are supposed to expand as well. So we might have a couple of years where we get a lot of rain and a few big events, and then we might have many years like we've had over the last 10 to 15 years where we have long periods of drought. Next slide. Wildfire is also a growing problem, both across California and in Southern California. And really the occurrence of these wildfires has increased pretty significantly across the state in both in frequency and intensity, but particularly in Southern California. And I think you all have seen the impacts of that firsthand. So increasing temperatures, changing the precipitation patterns can really create these periods of abnormally dry weather that can create drought. And so those warmer, drier summers, higher wind events, those can really create the conditions that are suitable for wildfires. And you all are familiar with this, and we're all familiar with the kind of the direct impacts of wildfire to buildings, to people, to agriculture, to ecosystems. But they can also be a significant source of air pollution, and wildfires can cause air quality to be 5 to 15 times worse than normal, and which really can impact both our social and our physical health overall. Next slide. And finally, sea levels are really rising at increasing rates around the globe, and sea levels have risen by about half a foot in California since the mid-1900s, or mid-19th century, excuse me, and are expected to continue into the future. Sea level rise is projected to rise around 3 feet by 2100, but there's a lot of variability in that, and melting ice sheets have the potential to accelerate that change much, much more quickly and to a much greater extent by 2100. And so we know that sea level rise itself doesn't act alone. We need to be thinking about things like high wave events, coastal storms, coastal erosion, as well as that passive flooding from sea level rise, because these all layer on top of each other. So it's not just one thing happening at a time. It's all of these changes to our coastal environments that place beaches, ecosystems, homes and businesses, the pier, and all those wonderful things about Ventura at risk to change. Next slide. And then finally, I've mentioned this a few times, but really climate change is a stress multiplier that will amplify existing inequities for the most socially vulnerable populations, not just in Ventura, across the region, across the state, across the globe. So we've begun to start to think about and analyze where some of those areas within the city have the populations that are the most socially vulnerable to climate change. And areas like West Side and Satakoy, for example, have some of the higher social vulnerability. So those are populations that maybe have less access to healthcare or less access to education, more pollution burden in those communities, which make them more susceptible to changes in the environment around them. And so as we start to develop the CARP, we'll be thinking specifically about how we can implement programs and policies that help support these communities. And then finally, while we know that climate change is serious and its impacts seem gigantic, and sometimes when I give these presentations, it becomes a little scary, to be totally honest. But we have power and the solutions to make changes and make these impacts more manageable and less costly in the future. But it's not easy. So we'll help define with you all some of the solutions to adapt to climate change that we have up on the screen. So these include emergency management, planning, communications, engagement, and hazard and asset-specific measures. And tonight you'll have an opportunity to start to explore those with us this evening. But equally important to the adaptation and resilience measures is our contribution to greenhouse gases in the potential emission reduction or mitigation strategies that you have available to you as a community to reduce those emissions. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Sammy Taylor to talk a little bit more about both greenhouse gases currently within the city and about some of the strategies to reduce those that you'll be talking about in your breakout rooms later on this evening. Okay.
Thanks, Eric. Hello, everyone. My name is Sammy Taylor, and I'm a Senior Sustainability Planner here at Ramey & Associates. So like Eric mentioned, I'm going to walk us through Ventura's contribution to climate change and ways the city and community can reduce those impacts. So next slide, please. So on the mitigation side, Eric mentioned we'll be focusing on mitigation and adaptation. So on the mitigation side, this is the city's current greenhouse gas inventory for the year of 2019. So you can see in this graph here that transportation is the largest contributor to emissions, accounting for nearly half of community-wide emissions, followed by energy use, which accounts for 35% of total emissions. So emissions have actually, we're seeing a positive trend. Emissions are decreasing, and they have decreased 9% as compared to the baseline year of 2015. Slide, please. So digging a little bit deeper into the trends that are kind of behind these greenhouse gas emissions between 2015 and 2019, you can see that emissions have decreased in most sectors. Most notably, transportation emissions decreased slightly due to cleaner vehicles, but VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, how much we're actually moving around in our cars, has actually increased 12% from 2015. So furthermore, the major decrease in electricity emissions is the direct result of the City Council's decision to enroll the city in the Clean Power Alliance in 2019. And the Clean Power Alliance is a community choice energy program that supplies the city with up to 100% renewable energy or renewable electricity, which is of course carbon-free. So again, you see that water emissions have fell as a result of robust conservation efforts, which are, as important as ever right now. And then the small increase we've seen in solid waste emissions are the direct result of additional waste being sent to landfill. So next slide, please. So like Eric mentioned, the state has adopted emissions reduction targets, and we'll go through those now. And these are what we're really working with in terms of how far and what we should strive to reduce our local emissions. So SB 32 set the goal of a 40% reduction by 2030, and Executive Order B5518 calls for the state to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. And this is the direction that most local governments and local communities are adopting in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions targets and what we're striving for today. So our 2030 goal is a goal that we would like to be able to hit and is required by the state in order to gain some benefits in terms of streamlining development, whereas the carbon neutrality target for 2045 is really at this point still aspirational for many communities, but we can set ourselves up now to be on the path to achieve that in the future. So next slide, please. So we've also forecasted the city's future emissions out to 2045 based on that 2019 emissions inventory. So the teal top line is the business as usual scenario. And this scenario is if no climate action is taken beyond anything that was done in 2019. So the yellow line below that is the adjusted business as usual scenario. And this scenario includes the reductions from state and federal climate policies. And then that gap, you can see with those two arrows in 2030 and 2045, between the yellow line and the dark blue line, which is our state emissions target line, is the emissions gap that local CARP measures need to close. Next slide, please. So moving on from that short debrief on emissions, we can look at ways to reduce our impact and reduce those emissions. So next slide, please. So in order to reduce those emissions and close that gap, we're starting to develop mitigation measures in these 5 sectors, and they track what we've measured in the community inventories so far. Next slide. So starting with clean energy, which is really the foundation of many of the greenhouse gas mitigation measures. And example measures in this sector are really designed to increase the amount of clean energy and electricity available in the city. So the first is to maintain participation in CPA, or the Clean Power Alliance, at that 100% renewable energy tier, to adopt solar reach codes, and to remove barriers and streamline the permitting process for solar battery and EV charging station installations. Next slide. So moving on to buildings, building energy use, if you remember, accounts for 35% of the community's total emissions. And there are really 2 approaches to reducing energy-related emissions or building energy-related emissions. The first is through electrification, to take advantage of that clean electricity being supplied by CPA. And the second is through energy efficiency. you can see here measures for new buildings. Although there are emissions associated with newer buildings, it's easier to reduce and decarbonize those newer buildings. However, most of the impact from our building energy use actually lies with existing buildings. But new building measure examples include implementing an all-electric reach code for new construction, setting the minimum panel capacity for residential new construction at 200 amps in order to accommodate electrified or future electrification of appliances and building systems, as well as EVs, and then providing incentives to encourage new development to really exceed those California building code requirements in terms of energy efficiency and go beyond that and become even more efficient. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, existing buildings are actually the larger contributor to building related emissions than the new construction. And they can also be more difficult to decarbonize and also more expensive. The most important example strategy in this sector is to create and implement an existing building electrification plan that incentivizes and as needed requires the transition of buildings to be powered by clean electricity or other carbon-free sources. So additionally, this electrification should be paired with energy efficiency measures and incentives to reduce energy use and create greener buildings. So next slide. So transportation is the city's largest contributor to emissions, accounting for nearly half of community emissions. It's also one of the hardest sectors in which to reduce emissions, since transportation patterns are not just local, but regional and sub-regional as well. But that being said, the CARP utilizes, again, two levers to reduce transportation-related emissions. The first is reducing vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, through mode shift away from single-occupancy vehicles. And the second is cleaning VMT through vehicle electrification, again, taking advantage of that clean power supplied by CPA. So transportation is challenging because although the city has direct control over its land use patterns, which are being explored further in the general plan update process, changing those current patterns to achieve a high non-single occupancy vehicle mode split can be challenging and often is a longer term undertaking. And in EVs, on the other hand, the city can only incentivize and promote their adoption. They can't actually command anyone to buy an electric vehicle. They can make it easier for people to drive one around. And of course, these draft measures here and these examples try to achieve both of those outcomes. So next slide. So solid waste accounts for 4% of community emissions, and the main measure here is really to create a waste reduction strategy that complies with SB 1383, which is a state law called the Short-Lived Climate Pollutants Act that requires diverting 75% of organic material. So that includes yard waste, food waste, and other organics from landfill. And the city is currently working on being in compliance with that. And these example measures complement that effort as well as address upstream waste reduction. So really establishing those compliance pathways and mechanisms for SB 1383 is the goal, and expanding the city's polystyrene ban to include single-use food serviceware and adopting a municipal sustainable purchasing strategy are some examples in this sector. So next slide. So although water and wastewater emissions account for less than 1% of community emissions, these example measures help to conserve water and thereby reduce the amount of energy required to distribute and treat it. The foundational items here and the examples here are to reduce water use through more efficient plumbing fixtures and more stringent efficiency standards for landscaping, and of course utilizing the state incentives that are already being provided by water utilities and exploring alternative water supplies that include recycled water, both at a regional scale or utility scale, but also streamlining the permit process for, residential laundry to landscape systems and even other gray water systems that can be considered recycled water. So next slide. And I'll hand it back over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Amy. I appreciate you going through all of those different measures. And tonight you're going to have an opportunity when we get to our open house to talk about those measures and ones that you have a preference for, ideas that you have that we didn't talk about this evening in those lists, and then really some of the barriers and opportunities to implement those particular measures locally. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through and take us through the last few slides, and then we're going to go into our breakout rooms. But just here's a quick graphic showing what's next in the process. So we're finalizing this round of community engagement on the CARP and summarizing what we heard. We'll then be preparing a public release draft of the Climate Action and Resilience Plan with the goal of having that document out for public review this fall. At this step in the process, you'll have additional opportunities to provide input on the plan itself. Next slide. So obviously you're here tonight, but there are other ways to stay involved and learn more about the process. So you can go to the general plan website at planventura.com. Thank you, Lily, for dropping that into the chat. You can take our survey online, which is open till August the 15th. We'd love for you to take this survey, share it with your friends, family, colleagues. We'd love to get as many people as possible to take the survey. And then finally, if you have questions on the CARP, please feel free to email the project team directly at planventura@cityofventura.ca.gov with specific questions that you have. All right, next slide. So now we're going to really transition into the most important part of the open house tonight, where you can share your knowledge and ideas about climate change, greenhouse gases with us this evening. So that you spend the time on the topics that are most important to you or that you prefer, we've created Zoom breakout rooms for different topics. So in room 1, you'll be able to go and discuss clean energy, buildings, water. In room 2, you can go and talk about land use and transportation. In room 3, you can talk about solid waste. In room 4, you can talk about resilience and climate adaptation. And you'll see the room numbers and the topics on the right-hand side of the screen right now. We also have a Spanish language room where you can go and discuss all of those topics facilitated in Spanish by one of our staff this evening. So we have about an hour for this part of the open house. And during that time, you can spend as much time in any of the rooms as you prefer. And just like an in-person open house, like we had back in July, you can vote with your feet and move from room to room at any time. In a minute, we'll have Lily open up the rooms and a Zoom pop-up will appear on the screen. And all you have to do is click to join the room that you want to, and you'll move into that room. At any time, if you'd like to switch rooms, just simply click on the breakout rooms icon that you can see on your screen now. That's at the bottom of your screen, and then join another room. So one last slide, so you can go to the next slide. So as with all community discussions, we all know that they work best if we're respectful of each other. So we ask that you all be courteous and follow these basic ground rules for the evening. Be respectful of your fellow participants. Be concise so that everyone has an opportunity to share. It helps if you just share one idea at a time. Listen to what others have to say with an open heart and an open mind. And then really, to minimize background noise, please keep yourself muted when you are not speaking. Raise your hand if you'd like to speak and wait for the facilitator to invite your comment. I think there are a few of us tonight, so you'll have lots of opportunity to share with your facilitator in the breakout rooms your thoughts. We are going to come back in about an hour and we'll do a little bit of a report back from each of the rooms. So if you stick around that long, you'll hear a little bit about what was shared in each of the rooms at the end during the presentation. So with that, Lily, I think we are ready to open the breakout rooms for everyone this evening. So we look forward to seeing you in those rooms, and we're happy to answer questions and chat with you about each of these different topics this evening. We're going to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes just doing a quick report back, and I'm going to ask the facilitator from each of the breakout rooms to do kind of a quick 3-4 minute summary of some of the themes that you heard in your group and the types of things you talked about and discussed in your room. So I'm going to start with Sammy in room 1, which is building energy and water. Sammy, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you heard, what some of the priorities were, and some ideas maybe that weren't listed that you heard as part of your group.
Sure. So thanks everyone for participating in the building energy and water room. We had a great discussion, lots of new ideas were put forward. So it was a really insightful conversation. So some of the major themes and topic areas that we focused on were solar plus storage, and some of the new developments that are happening around that space in terms of vehicle to grid charging, which essentially is many of the new electric vehicles can essentially function as batteries to power your home in the event of a power outage, or to supplement basically your access to power at peak times of day or when it's beneficial. So two-way charging between your house and your vehicle, which is something that's coming online and could really change people's ability to access storage systems. So that's something that we've really focused on, perhaps requiring solar panels for new construction, high-rise new construction, since the building code essentially already requires it for lower construction. So we focused a bit on that. Some of the other topics that connecting people to resources, both educational, informational, and also connecting people to the available incentives that are already being offered by the utilities. And we also talked about some of the incentives that we might like to see be provided, both either by the utilities or at the local level, if that's at all possible. So we really talked about some, having those incentives address some of the barriers to electrification in buildings. So mainly focusing on infrastructure upgrades, so panel upgrades, wiring, things like that, the things that would prevent someone from installing electric building systems or appliances, but are not incentivized because they're not that system or appliance. So really focusing on that supportive infrastructure. Some of the other things that we talked about included, really working as a city and a community to maintain that participation at the 100% renewable tier of CPA, and really questioning how do we get people to stop opting out or opting down. And I think, that really touches on, again, the educational component of all of this, and really providing resources to people and helping them to understand, the importance or the impacts of some of the actions or choices that they make. And I think those are kind of the main takeaways. We did, of course, touch on water, and this was the water room. Some of the things were more, drought tolerant, climate friendly plantings, as well as kind of creating landscapes that not only save water, but can sequester carbon or store carbon from the atmosphere and create habitat. So those are some of the main takeaways from the water, building, and energy room.
Terrific. Thanks, Sammy. I appreciate the synopsis from your room. Now let's go on to room number 2, which is transportation and land use. Adriana, would you like to please talk a little bit about what we heard in our room?
Yeah, so we first discussed 4 different policies related to transportation across the city of Ventura, and folks found it really difficult to find the priority just because these are all very hot issues. The first one is use a mix of incentives and requirements to reduce car travel and encourage walking, biking, and transit. And a lot of folks chose that as a priority out of the 4. Reform parking standards to prioritize parking for bicycles, car share, and electric vehicles. Again, it was rated pretty highly. Incorporate bicycle and pedestrian improvements into roadway projects. And lastly, expand publicly accessible electric vehicle charging. And some of the ideas that came with these policies were really to electrify specific types of vehicles. So one person shared that a good idea would be to electrify the postal fleet, as well as work from home. Oh, an idea for Ventura to choose specific days, or people living in Ventura to choose specific days to work from home, including city staff, in order to reduce vehicle miles traveled across the city. More charging stations, heat island mitigation measures for those who are commuting beyond just in the car, and really just a lot of concern for the current roadways that exist and their configurations and how that can pose just a lot of some danger for people who are not driving, so pedestrians and cyclists. Other folks were in the same vein as safety. They were thinking about more pool type of vehicles to transport children as well as seniors to appointments to ensure that they're safe while they are getting around Ventura, and also reducing those vehicle miles traveled, as well as safety for bikes, and just ensuring that, you know, it's a holistic approach in terms of transportation, meaning that one, if bike lanes are implemented, ensuring that those bikes are also safely there for people to come back to, and they are more encouraged to continue biking without the risk of having their bike lost or stolen. Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana. Let's see, the third group in the third room was solid waste. And Ariana, I know you didn't have quite as many participants, but I know a few people came in and flooded you at the very end. Tell us a little bit about what you heard and some of the ideas you heard in your group.
Yeah, we did have some limited participation, and it got a couple thoughts at the very end, a couple more thoughts at the very end. But some concerns around food waste recycling were the need to bag food waste. So in the city of Ventura, we have a bagging program for food waste recycling. So some concerns about the use of plastic there. Also, sort of like the cost benefit analysis of food waste recycling due to the distance of recycling facilities and other economic factors that play into the process of recycling food, and does it really contribute overall to a greater reduction in emissions. And then ideas to reduce emissions, we actually saw a higher cost of solid waste collection to disincentivize waste generation. Food waste recycling at large events and facilities, and then also some satisfaction with the various recycling programs that already exist in the city.
Thank you, appreciate that. And if you have other ideas on solid waste and you're going to get an opportunity to share them tonight, please feel free to share them with our team. And then finally, Robin, why don't you tell us about what you discussed and heard in the climate adaptation and resilience room, please.
Yeah, we had a really great conversation that spanned many topics. I'll just go a little bit in chronological order. We first started off thinking about that one of the major challenges for climate adaptation is knowing where even to start. This was something that got brought up by multiple people as like the size of the problem has made it difficult for people to really act on this, even if they support climate adaptation generally. So some things that people brought up to help to ameliorate that problem would be a public education campaign to help people know about what climate change is and what exactly they can do. In particular, someone mentioned having some kind of menu of things that people can do to their homes when it's going to be, sold or re-rented, various kinds of improvements that could be done for different types of hazards. So that was a cool idea. Another thing about that was having leadership at different levels, like school boards, special districts, the city, to engage with people and to show leadership to the community, especially youth who someone has mentioned, they interact directly with a lot of youth and have knows they're experiencing a lot of climate anxiety. Okay, so that kind of covers that. We did also have some specific conversation about sea level rise adaptation and the fact that there needs to be nuance with that. Someone brought up not relying on built interventions like seawalls, but trying to be more nature-based solutions. There was also a conversation there about the nuance needed as far as requirements for development in the shoreline area. There's some nuance needed between not allowing maybe residential or single-family residential, what is needed for critical commercial infrastructure in those zones. So yeah, you can't, basically the sentiment of not painting the coastal area with a wide brush. And yeah, and there was also a conversation about habitat and the importance of getting back to our natural roots and what that can do for the environment, as well as sort of community connectedness and connection with the ecosystem and the earth. So covered a lot, but we had a really great conversation.
Thank you, Robin. And I know this is amplified in a couple of the comments and summary, and I did hear a lot in our group as well in transportation about the city really being a leader in this and continuing to take environmental actions that support the climate and resilience goals that we've all been talking about this evening. And I think that resonated amongst all of the breakout rooms. Just before we leave and I hand over to Neda one last time, I just want to say, just remember to stay involved in the process. Again, you're welcome to visit the general plan website, and I encourage you to get involved in the general plan if you aren't already, in the active transportation plan as well. So you can go to planventura.com for more information on those processes. Again, we have an online survey that is available until August the 15th. You're welcome to, even though you're here, you're welcome to take the survey. Please share with your friends, your family, your colleagues who are not able to make it here this evening. And then finally, if you have any questions or other ideas and you want to share them with the CARP team, please feel free to email us at planventura@cityofventura.ca.gov, and we can quickly, I think, drop that into the chat if someone's quick, and you can let us know. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's 2 hours on a Thursday night. I know it's a lot to give up in your personal life, so we really appreciate you being here, and thank you for your participation. We look forward to seeing you in the future. And with that, I'll hand it over to Neda. Thank you.
I'm just going to echo a lot of what Eric just said, but thank you so much for coming. I had the opportunity from hopping from breakout room to breakout room and heard a lot of great comments and discussions. And thank you so much for all of your ideas. It's going to be super helpful. Please do sign up for the mailing list if you have not already, so you can get updates and email blasts about all the events. We are going to be wrapping up our public engagement this month through summer, and then putting together the draft climate action and resilience plan for release in fall, building on a lot of the work that we've done through our public engagement and background analysis, as well as building on the work that was done with the energy action plan. And then we'll be looking at how we integrate those documents together and release it. So please do look out for information about the draft release, and we'd love to have you all take a look at it and give us any feedback on that. So thank you for taking your Thursday evening to be with us, and we hope to see you in the future. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.